Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 5 ways to fix the Last Kaleidosaur. Now in the past when I've done these videos talking about how to fix a card, it's usually nerfing the card essentially. If it feels a little bit unfair or unbalanced, then I suggest some ways to tone it down just a little bit so that it's a more enjoyable or more fair card. This time around, though, with the Last Kaleidosaur, I'll actually be doing the opposite. The Last Kaleidosaur, unfortunately, looks far and away to be the worst of the new legendary quests introduced with Journey to Unguro. So far, no one has really been able to build a cohesive list that competes at a very high level in ranked play, which is unfortunate because this is one of the cooler quests as far as the reward is concerned. Galvadon is a super cool play. It's a unique thing we've never seen before. Getting a minion that can adapt 5 times has tons of crazy potential, and it seems like it'd be awesome if only the quest itself was actually good. The problem, of course, with the Last Kaleidosaur is simply that casting 6 spells on your minions is one of 2 things. It's either very difficult to accomplish in a deck list that is otherwise strong because you need to run more active and reactive cards than spells often are, or otherwise if you do build a list that it makes it simple to cast 6 spells on your minions, in other words a super hyper aggressive list with a lot of cheap buffs, then there's just not enough raw strength in the deck to actually survive as you sacrifice all that tempo and board presence you tried to build up while spending a couple turns essentially setting up Galvadon. You typically lose before that really works. Now of course I'm sure some of you out there have made a Galvadon deck that's won a few games here and there, and you're going to tell me, oh, the card is fine. But the card is not competing at a high level, and frankly, as much as Blizzard has designed around all of their legendary quests, and they want these to clearly be significant and important cards, and people who get this out of a card pack definitely want to be able to play this in some sort of competitive environment. For all those reasons, I do think it's important that the Last Kaleidosaur actually does support some kind of competitive deck. Even if it's not a tier 1 deck, it needs to be somewhere on that list. Maybe even a tier 4 deck that people can goof around with, complete some quests, so on and so forth, would still be a much healthier experience for people who got this card in a card pack or just want to have fun playing Galvadon, which is a reasonable reason to make a card good. So all that said, I've got 5 sort of tweaks or changes to either this card or ways to support this card that I think would actually fix it and make it much more relevant in today's Hearthstone meta. So all that said, let's go ahead and jump into this list. Starting off with my first suggestion, and that is that instead of requiring you to cast a specific number of spells or buffs on a minion, that instead the card is actually based on the total number of stats by which you have buffed your minions. In other words, this would open up the channel to activate the quest in a few different ways. First and foremost is that would actually tie back into the previous expansion's mechanic, which was hand buffing, and Paladin got a lot of hand buff cards, but hand buff cards are absolutely useless as far as triggering the quest is concerned. So if this were to go through as a change, essentially anytime you hand buffed minions in your hand, that would also help you trigger the Last Kaleidosaur quest. Now, it obviously needs to be more than just 6 stats buffed, but it could be something like buff your minions a total of 20/20. Or you could say 40 total stats, right? In that case, if you landed a hand buff card that buffed 5 minions, +1/+1, then essentially that would give you a 10 stats buffed on your way to 40. Casting Blessing of Kings would give you another 8. That put you at 18. Using Battle Cry minions that permanently buffed another minion could give you even more stats. So essentially you'd have 2 extra channels which you would feed into the quest. And this would work a lot better for what Paladin is trying to do, because both hand buffs and onboard minion-based Battle Cry buffs sacrifice less and don't require nearly as much board initiative as do just targeted spells. In other words, Blessing of Kings, you have to have a minion on board to make that good. Playing a hand buff card, you absolutely don't. You can just toss it down on its own and you're still going to get value in your hand, and you're going to pass back value into the quest as well. So not only would this help support other things that Paladin wants to do and actually revive a mechanic I would argue failed Paladin in the previous expansion as well, it also make the quest better too. So taking a class that has had some struggles in the past 2 expansions, although Paladin is viable now, just not via the quest. But anyway, this would help revive that mechanic and make the new mechanic, the quest mechanic, also viable too. So I think this would actually go a long way towards fixing the problem. So let's move on to my second suggestion, and this is another one that I think thematically just makes a lot of sense with both Galvadon and the expansion, and that is that you could make the Last Kaleidosaur quest just require a specific number of adapt minions being played. Right now, Galvadon adapts 5 times, so it's all about that evolution of dinosaurs in the crater of Unguro. So why not make the rest of the deck that same kind of theme, where you have to continually adapt minions to build some sort of super Galvadon, super adapted minion, right? It all sort of fits together thematically. And there's a lot of adaptive minions available in the game right now. That would probably reduce the lifespan of the quest to some extent in future expansions. I don't expect we'll see a lot of adapt cards, so that would be one potential downside here, but it would certainly make this an easier quest to activate currently in the Journey to Unguro meta, because there are good adapt minions that Paladin would love to run, and you can build a pretty smooth curve out of adapt minions. Now, it would take some tuning to find out the exact number of adapt minions that are necessary to be played, but other quests range basically from like 4 to 7, and that feels like a totally fine range here too. The only danger, of course, is that Galvadon is incredibly good and a very powerful card to play, so you have to be careful about where you draw that line, right? If you make it far too easy without actually sacrificing anything, then Galvadon could dominate games and just be an instant win half the time, which would be far too powerful. So probably something more like 7 or 8 adapt minions required, but at least you wouldn't be totally sacrificing a coherent game plan along the way to getting to your Galvadon, as you kind of have to do now when it's concerned with buffing or casting spells on your minions. Usually that disjoints your deck so much that nothing really flows or fits. This wouldn't require you to have such a disjointed deck. You could still play minions on curve, do things that you want to do already while still passively activating your quest, which is much more representative of what we see in the other quests in the game. Moving on to my third fix, this is one that wouldn't require you to cast spells specifically on your own minions, but allow you to cast spells on enemy minions too, and that basically opens up a few extra cards that you might want to run in your deck that make you a little bit more reactive instead of constantly requiring you to be proactive with minions on the board and buffing those minions. With this subtle change, suddenly things like Humility become a really good card to run, because Humility has already got a lot of utility in Control Paladin decks, nerfing a giant attacked minion across from your opponent, across from you on your opponent's side of the board, and then using something like Stampeding Kodo to kill that minion instantly. That's a classic Paladin combo that you like to run anyway, and even if you don't have the Kodo, just nerfing an attack value can be very valuable on its own. And if that also fed back into your quest, imagine how good that would be. Cards like Holy Wrath or Hammer of Wrath would also benefit from this, because those are actually targeted spells. So you could run Hammer of Wrath as some sort of card draw / removal option to fill out your deck and make you much more reactive as far as your opponent's side of the board is concerned. So this would again just be one of those things that subtly opens up a couple extra channels to complete the quest, making it slightly easier and giving you more options when building a flexible deck that is good in a variety of matchups. Up next is my fourth recommendation, and this one's probably the most elegant or simple of them all, because it's just a number tweak on the card. And I might get the number wrong, but this is not something for me to decide. This would be something for Blizzard to figure out. And that is that you could simply reduce the number of targeted spells required to activate the quest to 4. Maybe 5 would be enough, but I suspect it actually wouldn't. I think 4 is what it's going to take to make this more viable. Again, this is slightly dangerous, because if you make it too easy to get Galvadon out, that's going to turn the deck into a destructive force on the ladder itself. But honestly, it's so hard to develop a minion and buff it without sacrificing card advantage or value that this might actually still be the right number. There's just not that many good buffs, and often if they're very cheap, which allows you to get them out very quickly, then they're not doing enough to the board and you're falling behind, and then you have to play Galvadon, and that takes an entire turn before you get to actually attack with Galvadon. So you essentially give your opponent a lot of time to kill you, to make really efficient trades before then. Even if you get Galvadon out, taunts are so common in the meta right now that Galvadon might actually not even be able to do anything a lot of the time. So I think that this would still keep Galvadon within a tight leash and prevent him from dominating, but would make it so much easier to actually get to Galvadon and give decks more options as far as balancing their curve and cutting back on the number of buffs required, and therefore allowing them to run slightly better minions along the process. So this just gives the deck potentially more flexibility and makes it far smoother when it comes to actually playing out what you need to do to get to Galvadon. So whether the number is 4 or 5, or maybe even it's 3, who knows, right? That's again not something for me to figure out. That would be on Blizzard to balance. But ultimately, 6 is pretty clearly too high to build a consistently strong deck. So toning back on that requirement would definitely help this card find some success. And then finally, for my 5th suggestion, this one might sound a little bit like a cop-out, but ultimately I think this is the thing that has to happen for the Last Kaleidosaur to really find success, because I don't think Blizzard is going to change the card, but this is something they can do to make it good in the future, and that is simply that you need to release better cards that support that buffing archetype. Right now, there are certainly some cards that do support it, but they're often not fast enough, and they're more about value or card advantage than they are about board presence. And ultimately, Hearthstone is a board presence game. You have to get minions out, you have to get stats and bodies on the board, and maybe there just need to be some cards that really synergize with buffs to make that successful. In other words, right now you have a card that when it dies with buffs on it, it passes those buffs back to your hand. That's a really slow play because you have to play those buffs again. You have to spend that mana again. You have to develop another minion. What if instead you had a minion that was really cheap and said doubles the effect of all stat buffs on this minion? So say it's a 1/1 for 2 mana, and you cast Blessing of Kings on it, and suddenly, instead of giving it +4/+4, it gives it +8/+8. And that makes your buffs so much stronger and makes them a harder thing for your opponent to ignore, gives you so much more board presence. That kind of card is awesome. A card like the Vorax is actually a card that gets close to this. It helps you really increase the value of your buffs, but that's just one card. That's one legendary. So it doesn't take up enough of your list to actually make a significant impact. Imagine 3, 4, 5 more cards like that that really help you support buffs, and suddenly you've got a deck that starts to make a lot more sense. So at the end of the day, I think this is what Blizzard's going to have to do. In other words, maybe it's just not time to find the Last Kaleidosaur. Maybe we have to wait for another expansion before Galvadon really becomes an impactful part of the meta. And there you have it. Those are my 5 fixes for the Last Kaleidosaur. I'm very curious what you guys have to say. What do you think would make this quest more playable? What is going to be necessary for Paladin to find a way to make this card work? Share your thoughts and comments and questions in the comments below. I'll be happy to read everything. I know my great community will chime in with some feedback and discussion as well. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.